Rod Serling was the original woke artist and social justice warrior. Hello, and welcome to Science Fiction, Race, and Racism. This is a video blogging channel about the most famous and influential works in science fiction and how they deal with issues of race, ethnicity, racism, prejudice, and intolerance. Both the best and the worst, the most groundbreaking and insightful, but also the most clueless and callous. Science fiction has a long history of both being opposed to racism, prejudice, and intolerance, but also of conscious or unconscious racism. Sci-fi fans, authors, and works are often said to be above, beyond, incapable of, and far past any prejudice. That is often the appeal of sci-fi, especially the most utopian works. Sometimes a sci-fi setting, story, or theme can be another way to comment upon, critique, or even tear apart prejudice and hatred. For others, sci-fi is pure escapism, a way to get away from such issues. Sometimes this backfires. The most escapist sci-fi works are often the most racist. Sometimes the same three approaches or beliefs coexist within a work of sci-fi, within an author or a sci-fi fan. My name is Carroll. I'm Associate Professor of History at Northern Virginia Community College. I teach American, American Indian, and Latin American history. I've written mostly about wars, veterans, human rights, and genocide. I've also written some science fiction, mostly alternate history, including a sci-fi alternate history book, The Man in Black, the first of a series. After Star Trek, The Twilight Zone is the most acclaimed, influential, and revered sci-fi TV series of all time. Even though shot in black and white in the late 50s and early 60s, sci-fi fans, authors, and directors continue to watch, refer to, and imitate it to this day. Its accomplishment is that much greater because it was an anthology, with no recurring characters, settings, or background. Nothing tied it together except its narrator and creator, promising mind-blowing, insightful, and socially conscious sci-fi or fantasy each week. Rod Serling was an accomplished Jewish screenwriter who lived barely 50 years, but had a huge cultural impact. Serling volunteered to fight in World War II, joining the day after his high school graduation. He was disappointed to be sent to the Pacific, wanting to fight the Nazis. He was wounded 3 times, getting Purple Hearts and the Bronze Star, serving as both a paratrooper and in demolitions. After the war, he finished college and started writing for radio and TV. His most famous early work was Requiem for a Heavyweight for Playhouse 90. But he became fed up with the network censoring his work. A Playhouse 90 episode called Town Has Turned to Dust starred Rod Steiger and a young William Shatner. It is about the lynching of a Jewish man in the South. It was altered by network censors because it was inspired by the notorious murder of Emmett Till, a 13-year-old black boy. Even though Serling changed the victim from black to Jewish and from 13 to an adult, that was not enough. It was censored. The victim was further changed from Jewish to a foreigner, and the setting to New England, to avoid upsetting Southern white racists. So Serling deliberately chose to create a fantasy and sci-fi series and use settings as both a way to avoid censorship, but also to get the public to think about social issues in other ways. Among the issues most commonly covered in the series were condemning racism, condemning war, dictatorship, public hysteria, and ignorance. Most of these were driven by Serling's personal experience or beliefs, his fighting fascism, fighting anti-Semitism, and other hatreds, hypocrisy, and injustice of all kinds. In today's terms, Serling was woke and proud of it. Serling was a social justice warrior. At least half a dozen episodes condemned the Cold War and bringing the world to the brink of nuclear war in just the first season alone. The most famous by far is The Monsters Are Due on Maple Street. The episode imagines a wave of hysteria and fear in an average neighborhood where neighbors turn on each other, imagining that they are in league with an alien invasion. Serling was obviously condemning McCarthyism and red baiting in an America where McCarthyism had just ended, and red baiting remained very common, as it still does even today. At least half a dozen Twilight Zone episodes featured black actors, something incredibly rare for the time. The Big Tall Wish even featured an all-black cast in its story of a prize fighter. The most famous Twilight Zone episode on racism is I Am the Night, Color Me Black. It is the story of a town that executes a white man for killing a racist to defend a black preacher. The town remains shrouded in darkness for it because of their hatred. But perhaps the most famous Twilight Zone episode of all is Eye of the Beholder. A young woman is forced to undergo plastic surgery to end her supposed ugliness. In the end, it's revealed she is quite pretty, and the people of this land resemble mutated pig people, as in fascist pigs. Their leader is simply called the Leader, a fascist clearly modeled on Hitler, the Führer, which translated into English means the leader. The episode's argument is beauty standards are themselves prejudiced, implying that thinking of others as less beautiful potentially is racist. At least 2 other episodes explicitly condemn the same fascism that Serling and millions of other Antifa Americans fought to defeat. In The Man in the Bottle, a man with a bottle that grants wishes wished to become a powerful leader. He winds up becoming Hitler himself, surrounded and defeated in his bunker. In another, a neo-Nazi played by a young Dennis Hopper is taught by no less than the ghost of Hitler. And of course, Serling took on the Holocaust itself in the episode Death's Head Revisited, where a concentration camp guard is haunted by those he murdered. In 156 episodes in 5 years, Serling wrote 90 of them. Many others were written by famous sci-fi writers like Ray Bradbury and Richard Matheson. But for all of its critical acclaim, people often forget the network fought with Serling all the time, and often cut his budget. The Twilight Zone was actually canceled 3 times, brought back twice before Serling finally gave up. But the series continued to grow in stature and influence. Twilight Zone comics actually began while the series was still in its original run. So did book versions of Twilight Zone episodes and sci-fi magazines inspired by it. There were even board games based on Twilight Zone, and later on, early video games in the 1980s. Twilight Zone also inspired a long list of musicians. The first were surf rock bands like the Marquettes and the Ventures. They were joined by hard rock and metal bands, Golden Earring, Rush, Iron Maiden, and Anthrax. More pop performers like the Average White Band and Van Morrison also wrote Twilight Zone-inspired music. Classical composers like John Williams were also inspired, and legendary composers Bernard Herrmann and Jerry Goldsmith wrote for the original series. The series was turned into a film in 1983, only a few years after Serling's early death. This time, 4 famed directors, John Landis, Steven Spielberg, Joe Dante, and George Miller, each remade an episode. This time, presenting social issues in a fantasy setting only happens once. John Landis combined and remade the episodes Death's Head Revisited and The Quality of Mercy. The main character is a bigot who has to live as a person of color repeatedly. Vic Morrow first becomes a black man persecuted by the KKK, and then Vietnamese attacked by US soldiers, and finally a Jewish man being taken to a concentration camp. The film got mixed reviews, and this episode was widely condemned for killing 3 actors, including Morrow, in a helicopter accident. Landis was even charged with manslaughter, but acquitted. The minor success of the film led to Spielberg producing a revived series that ran for 3 years. Some original series episodes were remade, while others were by famed authors like Arthur Clarke and Stephen King. After initial high ratings, most viewers quit watching. Its last season was in syndication. This time there was no one like Serling to tie it together and give acerbic commentary. There was also no focus on social justice issues. Just like the film, it was mostly simple-minded attempts to be spooky rather than thoughtful. The second of 3 series remakes was in 2002 and lasted a single season. The first hint it would be terrible is that it was for the UPN network. It started off with a rock theme written by the band Korn. It had none of the famous writers previous series had, and it relied heavily on remakes of the original episodes. In 2019 came the 3rd remake of the series, by director Jordan Peele after the huge successes of his socially conscious horror films Get Out and Us. He has since created successful series in Lovecraft Country and Hunters. Twilight Zone has seen 2 seasons so far, to massive critical and popular acclaim. The film Get Out was in fact inspired and partly based on a Twilight Zone episode, Mirror Image. It should not be any surprise that Peele found much inspiration in Serling's work. Both have the same philosophy of using sci-fi, fantasy, horror, and dark or wry humor to spread messages of social justice to wide audiences. Where Serling's Jewish heritage and World War II experience drove much of his messages, Peele's central experience is being a mixed-race black man in an era of increasing racist backlash and the most vicious white nationalist president in 150 years. Peele remade the original Twilight Zone episode, Nightmare at 30,000 Feet, into a parable about fear of terrorism. The outstanding episode Replay is obviously influenced by Black Lives Matter. The main character tries to avoid herself or her son being murdered by a racist cop, only to conclude that the only way to stop him is to stand up to him, not avoid him. In the episode The Traveler, Peele went after a topic rarely covered by Hollywood, anti-native bigotry, and one of the few depictions of Inuit people. The episode has an alien spreading dissension, but the episode also went after fake news, colonization, corruption, even Russian espionage. The episode finally ends with asking the viewer to consider aliens would likely ask subordinate groups to side with them, much like European colonialists did in their invasions. The episode The Wonderkind is partly a remake of the original series episode It's a Good Life, about a 10-year-old boy with magic powers terrorizing everybody around him. This time, though, it's a political consultant who manages to get an 11-year-old kid elected president by a public that is fed up with politicians. This is an obvious critique of Trump, who often gets called an overgrown child or a man-baby. And it ends with the boy terrorizing everyone similar to Trump, even able to literally get away with killing someone, much like Trump brags about and has done on a massive scale, killing 300,000 Americans by COVID incompetence. The episode Not All Men went after male violence, concluding the explanations we use are just poor excuses, and that male violence is always a choice. Blue Scorpion targeted the deadly allure of guns. Point of Origin had its own twist on anti-immigrant hatred, as the government goes after another kind of alien, a sheltered suburban white housewife who is shocked to find out that she was born in another dimension. Mostly the first season was well received, but some criticism did come from those who were not its audience anyway, fragile and often racist white males. Those who are examples of white fragility and male fragility launched an online campaign against the series. So the second year, Peele stayed away from social issues far more, and not surprisingly, it was less well written and less critically acclaimed. Both came precisely from the lack of social issues. Just like Serling's original series, the best Twilight Zone writing had an unambiguous, downright radical message. This is the end of the 11th video. I look forward to your comments and questions. Please repost freely, like, share, and comment. Next video we will discuss Battlestar Galactica, Ancient Aliens, White Aliens. This has been Science Fiction, Race, and Racism video blog and channel.